Steve Hagger from Credit Suisse, representing also the various ASEAN exchanges. We are today delighted to welcome Bridget Welsh, who is a renowned commentator and analyst on ASEAN politics. Without further ado, I will hand over to Bridget.
Thank you very much, Steve-O, for a wonderful introduction and a very kind one, and Happy New Year to everyone. I'm going to share my presentation so that everyone has a chance to see what's going on, and as we go through over the next 50 minutes. And we're going to talk about what's happening inside ASEAN. Here we go. So, we've got a lot to talk about in a shorter period amount of time. So what I've decided to do today is to actually do two things. To look back on 2020 and sort of focus on some of the key developments, because I think it's useful for us to understand what's happened before we project what is going forward. And I think looking at those different dynamics are pretty important. I'm going to also identify some of the key flashpoints and the key trajectories of what's going to happen or what could happen in the year ahead. So if we look at 2020, we see a year of what we can talk about a mixed year for incumbents. Generally, the story has been two factors. One has been political survival. We see re-election, for example, the PAP, the NLD, actually performed even better than the PAP in returning back to power with higher popular vote. We saw also governments being able to hold on power, even though they were severely tested. For example, after the Sheraton move and the transition in power in February, Wu Yassen's government managed to hold on through at least two major tests and challenges to his power. We saw mass protests in Thailand, and similarly, we saw the government holding on in Thailand. We also saw a third trajectory, which was an unchallenged weaknesses of kind of, the power of Duterte in the Philippines, Jokowi in Indonesia, Hun Sen in Cambodia, and so forth. And of the political survival strategies, the country that perhaps did the best over the year was Vietnam. And also economically, which we'll come back to a little bit later. The second sort of major story from a political perspective was political exposure for Southeast Asian countries. We saw a kind of much closer, more telescopic lens on issues of questions of competency, and some of the governments were exposed for a lack of competency, for example, in Indonesia and in the Philippines. We saw the challenges of the weak health systems, most obvious in places like Myanmar. And we see the issues of bureaucratic strength in places like Vietnam and Singapore. And of course, we saw a kind of gradual, but not significant democratic contraction in places like Malaysia, Thailand, and Vietnam. And from a human rights perspective, there were considerable crackdowns. Some of that was, in the press, was focused largely on migrant communities, but I think we can see the closures and issues of freedom of expression and also freedom of assembly were quite significantly challenged across the region. Now, of course, the story of the year is unfortunately the story that everyone cannot stop talking about, which is COVID-19, because it's changed our lives in many fundamental ways. Earlier discussions have focused on these issues, but I'm going to sort of talk about it from a more political lens. We can see, for example, in looking at this chart of the cases, the countries that have the highest numbers of cases are Indonesia, Philippines, Malaysia, and Myanmar. And Myanmar's case numbers are, and the first three are rising exponentially, and with Malaysia as well. We've seen death cases and deaths rise particularly quite significantly since September. So what we can see is that Southeast Asia as a region has actually experiencing the worst from the health issues in the last few months. And this is in the places where that are the most deaths are, of course, the places where we see the most intensive concentration of cases. But the fact is that these numbers really are only kind of indicators, and they're indicators of things such as the issues of testing. We can look and see on this areas, the last column, the issues of the testing numbers. And of course, what we also see, as I've mentioned earlier, the healthcare system. We've seen low testing numbers across most of Southeast Asia, in some countries quite abysmally so, in places like Cambodia and Laos, for example. These are issues of resources. In some places that we've had relatively low cases testing in places like Thailand, which of course indicates a choice in this context. And of course, we see some exceptions to that. Brunei and Singapore have done pretty high testing, and of course, they have higher resources and higher GDP or GNP to capita. The winners and if there is that phrase winner, because there really is no winner in this pandemic, the countries that have been seen and projected as the most positive, of course, have been Vietnam and Thailand. Vietnam in particular, because it's the only country in the regions that expanded in terms of economic growth in a meaningful way. Indonesia, the Philippines, and Myanmar and Malaysia are seen to be among those that have been the worst affected by the COVID-19. And of course, everyone in terms of economic dimensions, and we'll talk about the synergies between economic and politics in a couple minutes. Now, there are kind of 4 or 5 kind of developments of 2020 that I want to pull out that I think are useful for us from a perspective of thinking about what trajectories might be ahead. So what we're seeing out of the experience of COVID and political dynamics and responses to COVID, we've seen quite considerable widening of inequalities and a kind of exposure of the weaknesses of the social safety net. Other panels have focused on the issues of economic contractions. Most people project growth like the IMF does for next year for most of the countries in the region. I think my own view is one has to be more hesitant about whether that growth levels are sort of realistic, given some of the issues of COVID management, which I'll come to. But also, I think the fact of the matter is that not everyone is experiencing the growth and the recovery or even the survival tactics quite the same way. So we've seen quite interesting and very challenging aspects of inequality come forward, and that they're tied into kind of issues of social services, such as different spectrums of learning, different dimensions of job security. We've seen unprecedented levels of unemployment. And keep in mind that Southeast Asia as a region generally does extremely well in terms of unemployment issues, but we now have some countries in the region that have really striking numbers of unemployment among young people. Philippines being a good example of that, Indonesia being another example. And keep in mind the demographic dynamics of that also reinforce some of these issues. And we've seen the fact that the countries across the region have very different limited social safety nets, particularly in areas of healthcare. A good example of that is in the questions of Myanmar. We've seen contractions of the middle class in many countries, including Indonesia, including Malaysia, arguably also one of the issues that is happening in Singapore. And we're seeing issues of the exposure of vulnerable groups that were already vulnerable, that have become increasingly vulnerable, and so much so that we're talking about, rising questions of food security and hunger that were not issues that were the same degree in Southeast Asia compared to the past. And because of COVID-19, there hasn't been the kind of same, should we say, focus and attention to some of these issues because they're seen as a product of the crisis as opposed to a product of governance. And the government's reactions have been to largely throw money through cash transfers, but of course they're quite minimalist in their capacity to address these issues long term, and also to deal with some of the structural underlying causes that promote some of these inequalities, which COVID has exposed, but not necessarily fundamentally caused. So we can see this big shift. And one of the reasons why I highlight these issues of inequality is because they become a source of contention in terms of political protest as things move forward. And I think we can see some countries, for example, like Thailand, Indonesia, and Vietnam, where inequalities issues are perceived quite widely, and they're also a source of cleavage and source of mobilization. And so, for example, if we look to 2021, to this year, one of the things that we will see is the potential of riots, protests, and around issues of inequality. And this is Indonesia being one of those places, for example. Another key area that has been brought to attention as a result of in 2020 has been questions of competency and trust. And I think what we see, for example, are really significant issues in terms of policy weaknesses and weak capacity that people tend to focus on the good stories of that the positive reactions, places like Singapore, but in fact, it is really within the region of ASEAN, the state capacity dynamic, often reinforced by economic resources, has become quite pronounced. It's a new source of regional division. We can see, if I had another slide of political trust, where Vietnam and Singapore would be very high, even Brunei. In terms of the slide, you would see political trust and institutional trust being a major factor that's contributed to why some of the policies by governments have been so successful. But what's interesting, I chose to choose this slide, this particular chart from the Asia Barometer Survey, which I'm a core member in, and this is the latest data of the last few years. You can see that social trust underscored some of the factors of why we have different patterns of resilience. So, for example, in Indonesia, while the political response was very weak comparatively, we saw lots of pockets of local activism and quite significant resilience in some communities as a result of different interventions by local civil society actors. And this in part reflects some of the social trust that exists. And in some other places, the government played a much bigger role. And why do I mention this? Is because as we think about 2021, where the issues of capacity and also the level of intervention and the capacity to continue to intervene will be quite important in determining how things and how there will be gaps or potential points of conflict as things move forward into this year. We also saw quite worrying, but also quite significant dynamics in terms of issues of polarization and xenophobia. 2020 saw migrant communities being really scapegoated, and probably in the most significant way they have been in the region for decades. And this is even arguably more serious than this happened in the Asian financial crisis, in part because migrant labor plays a much larger role in the regional economies. And we're talking about, easily 20 million people in the context of migrant labor. And this has, been very problematic because the migrant labor has also been the focal weakness points of issues of COVID-19 management. So the inability of states to want to include them and the inability of ASEAN countries to protect their foreign nationals abroad in these contexts of rising nationalism and xenophobic tensions has been problematic, and to say the least. We can see, for example, the most recent COVID-19 outbreak in Thailand, of which there were scapegoats of people from Myanmar. Another key dynamic has been the continued persistence of polarization. And this existed well before COVID-19, and it will exist well after COVID-19. But what is interesting is that during most of this last year, what we've seen is a kind of ebbing of some of the racial and religious dynamics within countries. But they have percolated, and they continue to be a source of focal point of potential protests. We saw this in Indonesia. Most recently, the founder here of FBI, FPI has been one of the organizations involving Islamic extremism has been actually banned. But the fact is the organization prepared for that. They've reallocated their resources. They're still organized as a major key mobilizer for issues of protest. And I think one has to understand that these religious groups will play a very important role to continue to capitalize on crisis, to gain position within the context of the various countries where race and religion play an important cleavage point in issues of polarization. And I think I've listed some of those countries: Indonesia, Thailand, excuse me, Cambodia, Myanmar, Malaysia, and Singapore. Excuse me. Someone doesn't like me speaking about these things. Let's continue. On a more positive note, what we've also seen has been considerable resilience, mixed with issues associated with rising cynicism and also increasing of local activism. So these phrases across the region, the government doesn't know best, let's kill the politicians, these types of comments, blame the politicians, have been at the focal point of a lot of the discussions. Because as governments have been asked to do more to respond to the crisis and fill, and those gaps have emerged, or in some ways, sometimes the politicians have made the situation worse, as we saw, for example, in Malaysia, where some of the politicians, not all, did not follow the SOPs. What we see are standard operating procedures associated with COVID-19. We see a situation where there has been this kind of change in outlook. And this, I think, is a really important fundamental tectonic shift that's taking place in society of how they see government, how they see themselves, and how they see empowerment at the very local level. This also has seen new organizations emerge, many of them local-based. I was doing a survey of kind of the philanthropy across Southeast Asia in different countries. We're talking about multiple billions of dollars of philanthropy at the very local level. There's just no real study of this, but it has become a source of kind of connectivity and also a new form of social safety net, but of course one that is less more fragile, and also not necessarily one that it may survive longer term, but it is a reflection of changing relationships. Finally, in the discussions, we've seen demographic dynamics affecting the political landscape. We saw the rise of youth movements, youth protests in Thailand, Indonesia, and Myanmar, but we've also seen youth movements more broadly in the region in places like Malaysia, even in Myanmar. And we've seen kind of stark differences in terms of the kind of aging population demographic, which places some greater burden issues on youth in terms of managing revenue and different issues in terms of the economy. You know, Thailand and Vietnam's aging population, for example, while things look very positive for them, also one of the we can see some of these real generational dynamics and pressures on younger citizens in these countries longer term. And I raise this because I think that the focal point as we look forward to this year and next year is how will the youth mobilize over the contracting economies? How will they be able to shift and to put pressures on the systems as things move forward? We saw also changes in regard to ASEAN. Vietnam managed to hold ASEAN together in this, but ASEAN as a regional organization did very little from a perspective of dealing with these issues. We saw limits in terms of the capacity to challenge the nationalist narratives that are very deeply embedded in Southeast Asian psyches and policy and orientations. And we saw considerable strain that this placed on regional neighbors, even neighbors that have had very good relationships, did not have as good relationships. And I think that where this is likely to still continue, where emphasis is being placed heavily on issues associated with closing borders and so forth. Now, we've also saw, importantly in the region, a great power rivalry, where China, the United States has had a very significant decline. China's power in the region by the end of the year, which had been well in place beforehand, really became very categorically much stronger. We saw different economic gains from China. A lot of the countries in the region, Thailand, Malaysia, and of course Vietnam and some Indonesia, benefited from the trade wars in the rivalry. But there's also, as we can see in polling, quite considerable numbers and suspicions about China in places, especially such, for example, of Indonesia. So while Jokowi's government moves towards a much more robust relationship with China, there's also a growing resistance to that robustness. So let's now turn to what do we see in the next year ahead in 2021. No question we see increased strain on incumbents. And I think that if I had to sort of identify two broad rubrics of what I see is happening, we're going to see new political and continued political challenges and also increased political pressures. So the challenges, I think, are going to be largely focused around the economic crisis. I think that it's too early to begin to talk about a recovery in anything meaningful way. We're going to see, we're having contestation over the very issues of COVID distribution and vaccine distribution and the management of COVID. COVID-19 is nowhere near from over and is likely to persist given the widespread infection in the community in many, many countries, it's going to be something that's going to take a long time to get under control. We're looking easily to the end of the year, not necessarily in the first or second quarter. And of course, one of the challenges is that many different countries in the region have different responses to COVID-19. We're going to see intensive oligarchic competition because of the weakness of responses. So then there will be obviously people who would like to find scapegoats, find people who would actually be a person to blame. I put, for example, one of the individuals who I think is going to be facing considerable challenges, Prayut in Thailand, as one of the examples that will be targeted by some of this. Weakened leadership, polarization. I think we're going to see more turn to race and religion and continued use of xenophobia. And of course, in a context where there isn't adequate support because everyone's focusing on their own problems as opposed to working in a cooperative fashion in this dynamic of inward-oriented dynamics in terms of politics. Political pressures are going to come from increased economic protests, youth mobilization. I think you're going to see oppositions that have been relatively weak begin to rejuvenate politically. And of course, there will be responses to that and repressive responses in some of the countries because they will have to, and this in turn will reinforce some of the political polarization that I discussed earlier. We're going to see exposures of the continued bureaucratic capacity or their lack thereof. And of course, we're going to see continued, I expect, democratic contractions as this dynamic becomes a discomfort. But keep in mind, there's no election supposed to be scheduled this year, with the exception potentially of that in Malaysia. If it gets to be held, we will see local elections and state elections in some countries, state elections, for example, in Malaysia. But in terms of the focal point and the sources of protests will be outside of existing conflict mechanisms and turn to the issues of mobilization, which of course is one of the challenges of dealing with an economic crisis. So I've prepared this kind of slide here to kind of give you some little taste of a smorgasbord, of a buffet of different political trajectories. Of course, we all know that political scientists are never good at predicting things, but at this time we sort of put some of these things out there to kind of highlight some of the key political points. Let me begin with a flashpoint that people probably have not paid attention to, which is Laos, which is about to default on its debt. I think, why do I raise Laos? Because Laos is a small country with no one gives it any attention. But I think that I raise it because it is a flashpoint. And of course, it will, when it has such a large default, which it's likely to have, the implication will be that this will bring greater attention to the region. And keep in mind that the Asia financial crisis started someplace with a problem that brought attention to the region that was probably imbalanced in how it happened. So I think this is something to be looking and thinking about as you move forward. We're going to see an election. It's not an election year in the Philippines, but by May, they'll start talking about the next year's election. In Indonesia, they're already talking about the next election and the next presidential election and politicking for this process at the leadership level. We're going to see Singapore has it's facing its worst economic crisis, and it did not come out of its elections in July last year in as strong a position as it hoped. So we can see different dynamics that are playing out in the different countries in this context. In Thailand, we're seeing a situation of persistent protest, and I think there'll probably be some elite scapegoating in order to be able to manage that. Vietnam looks, in terms of issues of political party Congress, is expected to go well. There's stability, but there will also be institutional problems of curtailing the growth that is coming in because there's quite considerable resistance to reforms, and this is unlikely to be able to overcome some of those obstacles. In the case of Myanmar, we see a situation where the NLD has come out of the election, is already trying to have conversations with the ethnic minorities that did poorly, but the conflicts are likely to continue to escalate because I think that there has been an inadequate attention to what's happening, trying to find some sort of resolution in Rakhine. There is problems associated with kind of now a much more dominant NLD vis-a-vis ethnic minorities that have been disempowered from the election. And of course, the military and its military party, connected to it, USDP, also feels a sense the exclusion from the perspective of what happened, and they're mobilizing around that. So it limits and curtails the ability for the NLD to be able to implement a much more reform agenda. And of course, NLD also faces the problem internally of being able to having an alternative leader to Aung San Suu Kyi. So what we're seeing is a very, internal, inward dynamics, but also consistent perpetuations of problems and challenges that exist within those countries, and within the countries in Southeast Asia. And they're not likely to make major shifts in terms of governments falling, with perhaps the expectation of Thailand and Malaysia. But what we also are seeing are considerable higher levels of political pressures. Now, one of the areas that is most interesting about what is happening in the context of looking ahead has to do with vaccine procurement. I understand one of the earlier speakers at least spoke about issues in Vietnam. I'd like to sort of talk a little bit about what we're seeing as of yesterday in terms of the vaccine procurement status and issues. And I think there are a couple bigger observations I'll make first, and then we'll come to some of the specifics. The first observation I would make is that if we look at Southeast Asia as a whole, we're not really looking to vaccine procurement until the second half of the year. In terms of as a meaningful kind of process where at least half of the region has access to vaccines. And this is not including issues associated with distribution of those vaccines in this context. So the second observation is that we also see high levels of inequality in terms of access and coverage of the vaccines of their respective populations. A third observation I would make is that the countries that actually have done poorly, for the most part, with Singapore being an exception, the countries that have done poorly in terms of COVID experience, so should I say some of the countries that have done poorly in terms of COVID experience have actually been quite proactive in dealing with issues of vaccine. While some of those countries that have done very well in terms of the COVID-19 experience, such as Vietnam and Thailand, have not been as proactive in dealing with vaccine procurement issues. So let me come to some of the specifics. Indonesia has a target of trying to reach 2/3 of its population. Given its population size, this is a very huge number of people, given that it's over around 250 million people. We're looking at a situation where they have had extraordinary active procurement strategies for vaccines. And Indonesia has been has had quite its health ministry and many of its government officials have been very pro-vaccine for many decades. And this is something that has actually had considerable traction. We've also seen a situation where the regime and the government has chosen to take a more open economy approach. So they recognize the centrality of vaccines to be able to underline and to address some of these concerns. And so we can see a diversification of their strategies of who they're getting their vaccines from, as well as considerable resources being allocated for the vaccine. In contrast to the Philippines, where Philippines has threatened to say, if you don't give me the vaccines, I'm going to kick out the bases. And their strategy arguably is one of the least defined, and everything is still in nego, which I mean here as negotiation in this context. Their targeting even is not necessarily been clearly specified. Now, we see other countries that have been doing extraordinarily well. Singapore has been very proactive, and it's already distributing the vaccine. Thailand, not as proactive. So we can see very low resolution in terms of numbers secured and considerable negotiations. Vietnam has done better and also trying to develop its local vaccine. Malaysia has also been relatively proactive and also diversified its contract strategy, while countries with less resources, such as Thailand, such as Myanmar, have tried to secure loans. For example, this is what's holding up their COVAX vaccine distribution. They've now made deals with India. They're trying to find more affordable options. And we can see countries like Brunei, and Cambodia, and Laos, smaller countries, have also not necessarily gained the same traction in dealing with their vaccine procurement. Now, why am I discussing this? Because I think that this is a source of political pressure. It reflects heavily on governance, but it also reflects on how there's a synergy with the economy as things move forward. And I think ASEAN as a whole will still be quite beleaguered by COVID-19 within its borders, even as it is from a perspective of the globe. Now, what are the kind of key points I would pull out from this conversation? One has been, I would say, a very kind of slow burn in terms of the management of the economic contraction. We've already seen 9 months of contraction, and we're likely to see further of that. It has a positive. There've been changes in governance priorities, but there's also been these social implications of which I've spoke to earlier. But unemployment is projected to get much worse in this year. And of course, this leads to anger and frustrations, also rising crime. We also see a situation of the widening vulnerabilities. It is starkly, deeply worrying to see some of the NGOs speak about the kind of demands that are being placed on for food and issues associated with nutrition and access to basic provisions that were always challenging in some parts of Southeast Asia, but have generally been something that Southeast Asia has managed as a whole very well, and been a role model for the rest of the world. I think what we're seeing are significant strains on this. And also there's testing on, there's strains on health professionals who have really been exhausted from what has been going on. And we can go to specifics in terms of where we see some of those pressure points, but we also see issues of challenges of resilience with non-state actors as well. In terms of ASEAN as a regional organization, we now move into Brunei as the chairmanship for ASEAN. Brunei has always had a very successful chairmanship. It has been quietly capable, being able to address problems, to work behind the scenes, to bridge people together and countries together in terms of having some sort of outcome. The only challenge, however, is Brunei is facing the fact that it is dealing with a less receptive region to ASEAN interventions in any meaningful, substantive way. And it will face the challenge of being able to get buy-in from different actors. And I think that their priorities have focused heavily on issues of trade, economic cooperation, and COVID. But again, the question is how to find the right balance and to be able to make those issues effective. I think from the perspective of looking at the U.S. administration, we see a situation where I think one of the few times I actually agree with Bilahari, a prominent foreign diplomat from the foreign ministry in Singapore, where he's talked about to sort of lower your expectations for the U.S. administration. I think here he's spot on. I think that the Biden administration is going to be focused heavily at home. And I think there has not really been a revamp of a kind of new Southeast Asia, a kind of different Southeast Asia strategy, or how to deal with both the Trump and the Obama legacies. Quite a few countries are now getting new ambassadors, which offer both opportunity but also a learning curve for the new leadership that exists that in terms of the diplomatic interventions in Southeast Asia. And Southeast Asia is by far not on the Biden administration's radar. There has not been someone decided for Asia policy, least of all Southeast Asia policy, to my understanding, although there has been talks about that in the U.S. Now, China's policies and interventions have much more been active, but this again goes back to the issue of how to balance and negotiate those resentments that might exist from a perspective of what is happening. And we're also seeing a kind of continued facilitation of some of these regional shifts that are taking place in Southeast Asia in terms of the rise of Vietnam and Indonesia, while also kind of the comparative advantages of countries like Thailand and Singapore and Malaysia are actually weakening. Singapore faces a real challenge of, its economic contraction has been unprecedented in its national history. And it will be a real deep challenge to deal with a more deglobalized world. I think in some ways the officials in Singapore are aware of that, But the question becomes, how can they recalibrate? And they have been very positive in terms of planning for the vaccine, but they've not necessarily been as positive in terms of planning for economic restructuring, which is a much more difficult thing to move back from away from their kind of immigration-driven model, for example. So let me sort of conclude to allow some time for questions and comments and differences of opinion, which I'm sure are quite expected. So I think the first thing I want to sort of caution and begin by saying, expect a surprise in 2021. We certainly got one in 2020. I think if anything the last year taught us is that you have to expect the unexpected in the context of things. So I know and recognize that my presentation has focused on some of the kind of challenges, maybe the glass less full than more full in a lot of areas. So maybe that is the surprise. And the surprise is that it's a much more positive trajectory than the one that I've spoke about. The second thing I wanted to say is that, in 2020, politics drove a lot of the instability. I think in this year, it's going to see the economy as the underlying driver for unrest and the pressures. And I think it's going to become much more prominent in this process, the contractions and how to deal with that as the slow burn becomes very painful increasingly for more, especially in the middle class, which is not used to having that discomfort. We're going to see a situation where in 2020, COVID-19 provided political cover for many governments. I think this is going to not be the case for exposure in 2021, where there's going to be more frustrations and more attention, less acceptance of not responding, given how long the pandemic has been going, and more exposure to some of the challenges of the weaknesses of state capacity. In 2020, resilience in terms of societal responses and activism at the local level was probably underappreciated. I would sort of say that in 2021, it becomes even more important because this is where I think the focal point where a lot of people will be trying to manage and eke out their survival. I'll stop there and thank you very much for your attention and look forward to your questions.
Hey, Bridget, thank you very much indeed for that excellent presentation. I'm just trying to do my camera. Here we go. Oops. I can see a lot of work's gone into it because this is all new stuff. If we can maybe drill down in a more traditional manner to some of the key issues in the varying ASEAN countries, that would be great. And some of these, of course, are uncomfortable topics for some. And maybe the most uncomfortable topic of all is the subject of royalty. Starting with Thailand, we have seen unprecedented demonstrations and a shifting of long-established views of Thai royalty. Do you believe that the royal institution can carry on, or is it mortally wounded?
I think the answer to that is that it can carry on, and it has been mortally wounded, but not necessarily fatally. I mean, it has been wounded, potentially death, but not quite there yet. I think one of the things that people need to appreciate is that the royalty has made two important changes and the Thai government has responded to these protests in two very interesting ways. The first of which is they have not cracked down on the protests. I think that their assumption is that these protests will peter out. I think this is a wrong assumption, where we may have more of a reckoning this year. But I think the fact of the matter is that they're assuming that if they give it time, that things will actually become an easier thing to manage. My own view is that may not be the case, given that these protests may become also a venue for other forms of protest about the economy and concerns, but we will see how that plays out. The second thing that's interesting about the way that Thai royalty has responded is that they've chosen to take a tactic of the message that the king has to stay in Thailand has sort of hit home. And so despite all the rather, should we say, less than should be needed responses in terms of how the Thai royalty has reacted. Where making more visits, cutting more ribbons, all the other things. He's actually doing that compared to the past. And so when I say that it's carrying on, there's been reforms in how the royalty has responded. But I think that the issue will be whether or not it can, if these tactics that they have adopted can actually allow it to continue to have to avoid that mortal reckoning as an institution. And because the royalty is very deeply entrenched in terms of the polarization of politics in Thailand, I think that one of the things that can happen is that it will start to mobilize alternative forces to protect the royalty. And what is interesting about 2020 is that we haven't seen those emerge, given that that in itself speaks to what's happening about this particular king compared to previous ones. So in answering your question, I think that we're still the full picture is still emerging, but there have been important steps that have been taken with the Thai royalty and responses that the government has taken that actually indicate that there is a recognition of the challenges and the shifting of politics and the systemic challenge of the system.
No, thank you very much. Maybe sticking with the theme of royalty, Singapore does not have a royal family, obviously, but arguably the closest thing to it might be the Lee family. We see in Singapore a designated successor in Heng, the current finance minister and DPM. I am told that his performance has been questionable over the last few months. Is he a seat warmer for a third generation Lee? Or is it possible, I'm told, that Lawrence Wong the Minister for National Development, has performed really quite well. Do you have a view there?
So we've seen essentially four things that have happened related to your long discussion and questions there. Number one is that the standing of the Lee family has actually taken a hit. It took a hit for the last few years, but I think it reached across the kind of these lines in the court cases involving his sister-in-law, and also the defamation cases, which have really kind of put Lee Hsien Loong under greater exposure. And while Singaporeans are divided about the Lee family, and they see many of these issues as kind of their internal problems, I think Lee Hsien Loong has been damaged by this process. The second thing is that the 4G leadership, of which Heng is supposed to be leading, really came under a test in the July elections, and of course the management of COVID-19. Heng performed pretty badly. Lawrence Wong performed well, and so did a few others. But some of what we saw is a kind of public responses against some of the four generation leaders. And I think the expectation after the July election was that Heng would be replaced, and there would be a kind of a different pecking order within that leadership within the PAP. I think that that has been decided that they will hold off that reckoning, because the infighting within the PAP and the four generation leadership is quite intense. Heng is seen as a bridge builder, but he has also come under intense pressure from a perspective of management of the economy, which by far has been the most serious contraction for Singapore. Now, is Lawrence Wong in the contention as an alternative? Yes, but there are others as well. Chan, as an example of that, and a few others. I think that the issue of a seat warmer or a new leader, I think, is actually likely. And I think that it's too early to see a new Lee emerge directly into that position. The question will become how close the person is to the Lee family, and how much they represent alternative voices within the PAP itself. And that internal division is playing itself out in the course of these issues. But right now they're united because they're focused on the crisis that the country is facing. And so they're putting aside some of their political differences. I think that we're going to see those things down the line. But it is a much weaker PAP than it was previously. A PAP that did poorly at the polls for the PAP. And it also is not necessarily an endorsement of the current leadership or even the future leadership. And that in itself, I think, makes the PAP rely more heavily on kind of less the levers of power, as opposed to trying to engage in sort of outreach, which probably would strengthen its position. But the problem is those internal divisions also curtail that, and there is the kind of deep practices that prevent them from kind of engaging in different systematic kind of different forms of engagement. So is there going to be a little Lee or new Lee now? I think we'll have to wait a little while longer.
Thank you very much. And yeah, sticking with the royal theme, the Malaysian royals have really been quite active of late. What is your view on really what their agenda is, and where is this going to go, and what have they been up to as far as influencing politics? I would say behind the scenes, but it's been fairly overt in some cases.
So someone asked me, who's the kingmaker in Malaysian politics? And I said, well, the king is the kingmaker in Malaysian politics. He can make or break what happens in terms of the political process. But I think the fact of the matter is that his role has increased because of the fragmentation that exists among the different political parties, divisions within parties, divisions among alliances. And I think that his role in activism has not been one that has been embraced with reluctance, as opposed to interventionist kind of activity, which is a very different type of royal intervention than we see from that of Thailand compared to that in Malaysia. Also, there are 9 sultans in Malaysia, and of course they affect the different states. What we've seen are differences among them about how their relative support of different systems and support of different actors. And so while they have vested interest in protecting Malay's institutions, reinforcing a kind of Malay prominent and majority role of Malay leadership in political power, they have actually had probably less interventionist kind of personalized interest compared to what we've seen in Thailand, comparatively so. We also see a situation where there are differences among themselves, and this played out, of course, when the government was expected to have emergency rule and hoping to have emergency rule declared in order to stay in power without having to have a budget vote. And I think that we saw those differences among the different sultans come to a position where there was no emergency rule. There is a new law that has recently passed, it comes to effect as of this month, which allows the royalty even more power on issues of emergency. And I think that the issue of the royalty will continue to be very pronounced, both at the state level and at the federal level. And this is unlikely to be resolved unless there is actually an emphatic election result, which I think is not likely to happen given the trajectories of what we've seen in the past. But we will probably see some, that's where there's increasing pressure to hold elections. My own view about elections is a little bit different than many of the analysts. Everyone is now watching how UMNO is about to leave the coalition for Muhyiddin Yassin. My view on this is they have nowhere to go. So they'd rather stay in power than not, but whether or not how far they go and whether or not they go. And then Muhyiddin Yassin still controls the levers of when to hold the election. And of course, the next real test will be in Parliament. There's a few days in Parliament for the 12th Malaysia Plan that's coming next week. And then there'll be subsequently issues in March. So whether or not there are votes and issues and movements, I think we have to see what sort of arenas they play out. And the king will play an important role in helping to decide these processes. And more generally, the king as a whole and the royalties have focused on issues of stability and, of course, COVID management. And I think they've served a kind of a much more nationalist-oriented type of kind of stabilizing effect and role.
Thank you very much. We could continue on this subject for a long time. Indonesia, you mentioned in your presentation that FPI has been banned. Is this a sort of one-off crackdown on perceived religious extremism, or is this an ongoing sort of rooting out of perceived extremism?
Well, it's difficult to say that you're rooting out extremism when you're letting Bashir out of prison. I think that there are conflicting signals being sent. And the nature of kind of extremism has actually become much more diverse. There's a marketplace of ideas, very variety different of organizations. And I think that it may talk good about dealing with issues of rooting out. The fundamental fact is that these organizations are deeply socially rooted. And what has happened during COVID-19, which I didn't talk about earlier, is that these organizations are part of the quote unquote social resilience, but that they're filling a gap of providing social services that the government aren't providing. And so they're actually gaining in traction in many communities. And they are, when we see the electioneering starting around for the presidency, which is already starting but will intensify, I expect in this year, I think that you're going to see these organizations try to capitalize on protests, as they did over the student protests in the past, and as they've done on issues of race and religion involving, for example, Governor Carter. So I think that the talk is good in terms of trying to address issues of extremism. There's been a really important appointment of a new religious minister that has actually been seen as more inclusive. But the problem is that these issues are deeply rooted. And in order to be able to fundamentally address them, there needs to be a recognition and of new strategies to deal with the political polarization. And that is yet not come about.
Thank you very much. We're getting very short on time, but we have a question that's just come in. What do you think China's stance to ASEAN countries would be in 2021, given all the current circumstances? In less than 3 minutes, please.
Well, when you're talking about China, it definitely takes more than 3 minutes, but I'll basically identify 3 different trajectories. I think one of the things that's happened is that for Chinese allies, the Cambodias, the Cambodias and the Philippines, not the Vietnams, one of the things that's happened is that China's promises have not necessarily always materialized. And so, this dependence on China has created a sense of looking at things a bit more carefully for these countries. They know they need China, but they also know that China is not always there for them. And I think that this is something that is actually emerging because China is focusing on bigger players. It's focusing its energy on Indonesia. It's focusing on even working in Vietnam. It's really consolidated a very strong relationship with Myanmar and also with the new Malaysian government. So we can see that the priorities for China and the experience of different countries as of being part of China and China's orbit or kind of lead allies for China in Southeast Asia have shifted. The second thing that I think is important is that China will really be trying to take the lead on the vaccine issues. And I think this is where it'll be interesting to see if the U.S. administration begins to get legs, in involving with vaccine in Southeast Asia. It has its own problems with vaccine. They were supposed to be in the U.S. 20 million vaccines were supposed to be distributed by the end of last year, only at 2 million. So it's very difficult to turn from U.S. from inside to outside. So in the case of China, I think we're going to see really an attempt to try to take the moral high ground in areas of debt, issues of loans, as well as issues associated with vaccine. So it's going to try to emerge as a much stronger player for the region in that context. And then what I didn't talk about is that I think that I expect that China is going to test the Biden administration. And it is most likely that I think that test will happen early on and will happen in Southeast Asia. And when that does, for example, in the South China Sea or a particular incident, and if it does happen, again, we will see, I think that those tests that Southeast Asia will be forced to make difficult decisions of which I think will not necessarily work in the U.S. favor or even China's favor, because it creates a lot of resentments that many countries in Southeast Asia feel.
With that fairly disturbing thought, on behalf of Credit Suisse, the ASEAN exchanges, and all our clients that have dialed in, Bridget Welsh, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Steve, and thanks to everybody for listening.
And Happy New Year.
Happy New Year, everybody.